Mariam's wedding day should have been the happiest moment of her life. Instead, it marked the beginning of her nightmare. The morning sun cast golden rays across the village of Kholsa, where generations had lived according to traditions older than memory itself. She stood in her family's mud brick home, draped in crimson silk embroidered with silver thread, her hands painted with intricate henna patterns that spiraled up to her elbows. Her mother wept as she placed the final piece of jewelry around her daughter's neck, a heavy necklace that felt more like a chain than an ornament. Mariam was 18 years old, carrying a child in her womb, and terrified of the man she was about to marry. Rashid was not a kind man. Everyone in the village knew this truth, though few dared speak it aloud. He was 43 years old, a merchant who had grown wealthy through means that remained deliberately vague. His first wife had died under mysterious circumstances 5 years earlier. His second wife had vanished into the desert, never to be heard from again. Now Mariam was to become his third wife, and the arrangement had nothing to do with love. Her father owed Rashid a considerable debt, the kind that could destroy a family's reputation and livelihood. When Rashid learned that Mariam was pregnant from a brief romance with a young carpenter who had since fled the village in fear, he saw an opportunity. He would marry her, claim the child as his own, and her father's debt would be forgiven. The alternative was public shame and financial ruin. The ceremony took place in Rashid's compound, a sprawling estate on the edge of the village where high walls kept secrets hidden from curious eyes. Traditional drums echoed through the courtyard as Mariam was led forward, her feet heavy as stones. She searched the crowd for a friendly face, for anyone who might intervene, but saw only averted gazes and nervous smiles. The imam recited verses from scripture while Rashid stood beside her, his face expressionless, his eyes cold as desert nights. When the ceremony concluded, he gripped her wrist with fingers that felt like iron bands. He leaned close and whispered words that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. He knew she did not want this marriage. He knew the child was not his. And he promised that she would pay for this humiliation in ways she could not yet imagine. That night, Mariam discovered the full extent of Rashid's cruelty. He did not touch her as a husband might touch a wife. Instead, he took her to a locked room at the back of his compound where the walls were stained with something dark that she tried not to identify. He told her about his previous wives, speaking with casual indifference about their suffering. The first had questioned his business dealings and threatened to tell the authorities about the illegal goods he smuggled across borders. The second had tried to run away when she learned the truth about her predecessor. Both had learned that Rashid did not forgive betrayal, and neither had survived their lessons. Mariam was different, he explained. She carried merchandise that would be valuable once it arrived, a child he could raise as his heir without the inconvenience of actually fathering one. But until that day came, she would be reminded daily of her place in his household. The weeks that followed were a blur of fear and isolation. Rashid kept Mariam locked in a small room with a single window too high to reach. She was given barely enough food to sustain herself and the growing child within her. Her family was forbidden from visiting, told that she was adjusting to married life and needed privacy. The other servants in the household avoided her, their eyes filled with pity they dared not express. Mariam spent her days staring at the cracked ceiling, feeling her baby move inside her, wondering if either of them would survive long enough to see freedom. She prayed to every saint and spirit she could remember, begging for deliverance from this living tomb. The desert wind howled outside her window at night, sounding almost like a voice calling her name, promising that salvation would come from the most unexpected source. 3 months into the marriage, Rashid announced they would be traveling. He had business in the city of Zeba, a journey that would take them through 200 miles of unforgiving desert. Mariam's heart leaped at the possibility of escape, of being seen by people outside Rashid's control, but her hope died quickly when she saw the preparations. Rashid was not taking chances with his reluctant bride. He had commissioned a special wagon, a heavy wooden structure pulled by 4 strong horses, and inside it was a cage. Not metaphorical bars of obligation or tradition, but actual iron bars welded together to create a mobile prison. Mariam would make this journey as cargo, not as a companion. The morning they departed, Rashid's servants dragged Mariam from her room before dawn. She fought them with the desperate strength of a cornered animal, but pregnancy had weakened her body even as it strengthened her determination to protect her unborn child. They forced her into a rough cotton dress, removed all her jewelry except for the wedding necklace which Rashid insisted she wear as a symbol of his ownership, and bound her wrists with rope that bit into her skin. When they brought her to the wagon, she saw the full horror of what Rashid had planned. The cage was barely large enough for her to sit upright, with no cushions or comfort, just bare wooden boards covered with a thin layer of straw like one might use for livestock. A chain was attached to the floor of the cage, and to Mariam's disbelief, Rashid himself locked a heavy iron shackle around her ankle. The caravan consisted of 5 wagons in total. The first 3 carried Rashid's legitimate goods, bolts of fabric and spices and copper pots that would fetch good prices in Zabar's markets. The 4th wagon was Mariam's prison. The 5th carried supplies and several of Rashid's most trusted men, brutal enforcers who asked no questions and showed no mercy. Rashid rode on horseback at the front of the caravan, occasionally dropping back to ensure his newest wife was suffering appropriately. The first day of travel was torture beyond anything Mariam had previously endured. The wagon had no suspension, and every rock and rut in the road sent jarring shocks through her spine. The sun climbed high and turned the cage into an oven. The iron bars became too hot to touch, and the air inside shimmered with heat that made breathing feel like inhaling fire. She was given water twice that day, barely enough to wet her cracked lips, and no food at all. By the 2nd day, Mariam began to understand that Rashid intended for her to die on this journey. The realization came not as a shock but as a grim confirmation of suspicions she had not wanted to acknowledge. He would claim she fell ill, that the hardship of travel was too much for her delicate condition, and no one would question the word of a respected merchant. The child would likely die with her, or if it survived, Rashid might cut it from her body and claim some tragic story about trying to save the baby after the mother's unfortunate demise. Either way, he would be free of the wife who reminded him of his own compromise, his acceptance of damaged goods to settle a debt. She screamed at him when he came to check on her that evening, demanded to know why he had married her at all if his intention was murder. He smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes, and explained that death in the desert was cleaner than divorce, required no witnesses or explanations, and left no loose ends that might come back to haunt him. On the 3rd day, something changed in Mariam. The survival instinct that had kept her docile and obedient, hoping that submission might earn mercy, finally broke under the weight of certain doom. If she was going to die, she would die fighting. She began working on the chain attached to her ankle, examining every link for weakness, testing the bolt that secured it to the wagon floor. The work was agonizing, requiring her to contort her pregnant body in the confined space, but rage gave her strength she did not know she possessed. Her fingers bled as she pried at the wood around the bolt, using a sharp stone she had found in the straw to slowly, methodically, dig into the wood. The noise of the wagon wheels covered the sound of her efforts, and the guards rarely looked inside the cage, apparently finding the sight of a suffering pregnant woman too uncomfortable for their consciences. By the 4th day, the caravan had entered the deep desert, where civilization was a memory and the landscape consisted of nothing but sand dunes and scattered rocks under a merciless sky. Mariam had loosened the bolt significantly, though it was not yet free. Her hands were raw and infected, her lips were split and bleeding from dehydration, and she could feel her baby moving less frequently, as if the child knew that survival was becoming less likely with each passing hour. That night, as the caravan made camp, Rashid visited her cage one final time. He told her they were a day's journey from the point of no return, a stretch of desert where no vegetation grew and no water could be found for 50 miles in any direction. If she was going to die, that would be the place. He would unchain her from the wagon, perhaps even give her a canteen with a few sips of water, and leave her to walk into the emptiness. The desert would take care of the rest, and his hands would remain technically clean of murder. Dawn broke on the 5th day with a sky the color of old blood. Mariam had not slept, her hands working frantically through the night at the bolt that was now loose enough to rattle but not yet free. She could hear the camp stirring outside, the men breaking down tents and loading wagons, preparing for the day's journey that Rashid had promised would be her last. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she gave one final, desperate twist to the bolt. The wood around it splintered with a crack that seemed impossibly loud, though the sound was swallowed by the morning wind. The bolt came free in her hands, and suddenly the chain that had bound her to the wagon floor was connected to nothing but her own ankle. She was still caged, still shackled, but for the first time in months, she was not anchored in place. The caravan began moving as the sun climbed higher. Mariam sat very still, the loose chain hidden beneath straw, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end in death. She could not escape while the wagon was moving. The cage was still locked from the outside, and even if she somehow broke free, where would she run in this ocean of sand? She had no food, no water, no knowledge of which direction led to salvation and which led deeper into the wasteland. But staying meant certain death, and at least running gave her a chance, however slim, of survival. She thought of her child, the innocent life depending entirely on her courage and will, and made a decision that felt both insane and absolutely necessary. She would wait for the moment when Rashid stopped to leave her in the desert, and then she would fight with everything she had left. That moment came sooner than expected. Around midday, when the heat had become a physical force that pressed down on the world like a giant hand, Rashid called for the caravan to halt. They had reached a place where the desert seemed to go on forever in every direction, where even the vultures were absent because nothing lived here long enough to die and provide them with meals. Rashid dismounted from his horse and walked back to Mariam's cage with a key in his hand and satisfaction on his face. He unlocked the cage door, gesturing for his men to stay back, apparently wanting to handle this final act personally. He reached in to grab Mariam's arm, intending to drag her out and remove the leg shackle before sending her to her death. He did not expect her to explode into violent motion, the loose chain whipping up and striking him across the face with enough force to split his cheek open. Rashid stumbled backward, blood pouring down his face, his shout of pain turning to rage. Mariam scrambled out of the cage, her pregnant belly making movement awkward but adrenaline lending her speed. She kicked at the nearest guard who tried to grab her, the iron shackle still attached to her ankle becoming a weapon as she swung her leg at his knee. He went down with a scream, and suddenly she was running, or what passed for running when you were 7 months pregnant and half-starved. The sand grabbed at her feet, each step requiring enormous effort, but terror drove her forward. Behind her, she heard Rashid shouting orders, heard the sound of men mounting horses, knew that she had perhaps seconds before they ran her down. She ran anyway, because dying while fighting for freedom felt more honorable than dying on her knees in a cage. Then the desert spoke. Mariam had heard stories all her life about the jinn who lived in wild places, spirits of wind and sand who followed their own laws and sometimes took interest in human affairs. She had always dismissed these tales as superstition, the kind of stories old women told to explain misfortune or account for strange occurrences that had rational explanations. But as she ran, the wind suddenly rose with impossible speed, going from a gentle breeze to a howling gale in mere seconds. Sand lifted from the ground in great sheets, transforming the air into a stinging, blinding wall of particles that made seeing more than a few feet impossible. Mariam heard horses screaming in fear, heard men shouting in confusion, but the sounds were muffled and distorted by the wind. She kept running, one hand protecting her belly, the other held up to shield her face, not knowing if she was running toward safety or deeper into danger. The sandstorm raged with a fury that seemed personal, as if the desert itself was angry at what had been done within its domain. Mariam stumbled and fell, her knees hitting hard ground, but when she looked up she saw something impossible. A rock formation rose before her, a cluster of massive boulders that created a small shelter from the wind. She crawled toward it, every muscle in her body screaming protest, and wedged herself into a gap between two rocks just large enough for her body. The stone was cool against her skin, and the wind screamed overhead but could not reach her in this protected space. She curled around her belly, feeling her baby kick strongly as if in relief, and listened to the storm rage. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, time losing meaning in the chaos. When the wind finally began to die down and the air started to clear, Mariam emerged cautiously from her shelter to see what the desert had wrought. The landscape had been transformed. The sandstorm had rearranged the desert with the casual power of a god reshaping clay. Dunes had moved, rocks had been scoured clean, and the tracks of the caravan had been completely erased as if Rashid and his men had never existed in this place. Mariam stood on shaking legs, turning in a slow circle, searching for any sign of her pursuers. For several long minutes, she saw nothing but endless sand and rock under a sky that had returned to its usual pitiless blue. Then she spotted something in the distance, a dark shape that resolved into wreckage as she walked closer. One of the wagons had been overturned, its contents scattered across the sand. Bolts of fabric fluttered in the gentle breeze that followed the storm, looking like the shed skin of some enormous serpent. She approached carefully, half expecting Rashid or his men to appear from behind the wreckage, but the wagon was abandoned. She found supplies scattered among the ruins, including a leather water bag that had somehow remained sealed and a canvas sack filled with dried dates and flatbread. The food and water represented salvation, a chance to survive long enough to find help, and she grabbed them with trembling hands. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a glint of metal half buried in the sand. She dug it free and discovered it was an iron key, the same key Rashid had used to lock her cage. With sudden understanding, she sat down on the sand and used the key to unlock the shackle from her ankle. The iron band fell away, leaving a raw, bleeding ring of damaged flesh, but she was finally, completely free. The mystery of what had happened to Rashid and his men resolved itself as Mariam explored further. She found one of the horses, dead from a broken neck, half buried in a drift of sand. Nearby was one of the guards, also dead, his face frozen in an expression of terror. She felt no remorse, only grim satisfaction that the universe had delivered justice more efficiently than any human law. She continued searching and found 2 more bodies, but Rashid himself was nowhere to be seen. She wondered if he had survived, if he was wandering the desert somewhere looking for her, but decided it did not matter. The desert was vast and cruel to those who did not respect it. If Rashid lived, he would likely not live long. She took what supplies she could carry, fashioning a sling from a piece of torn fabric to carry the water bag and food across her shoulders, and began walking. Direction was a guess, but Mariam remembered that the caravan had been traveling roughly east toward Zabar. If she headed west, she would eventually reach the territories they had passed through, areas where water and vegetation existed, where nomadic tribes sometimes traveled. The sun would guide her, rising in the east and setting in the west, a compass written in fire across the sky. She walked through the afternoon, resting frequently because her body was weak and her pregnancy made every step an effort. As evening approached and the temperature began to drop from unbearable to merely uncomfortable, she found herself thinking about the sandstorm. It had come at the exact moment she needed rescue, had separated her from her pursuers with surgical precision, and had even provided her with supplies and the key to her freedom. Coincidence seemed insufficient to explain such perfect timing. Night in the desert was a different world entirely. The temperature plummeted, turning the sand from a burning brand to a cold stone. Mariam had no blanket, no shelter, only the thin cotton dress that had been her prison uniform. She built a small fire using dried camel dung she found near one of the dead horses, a trick her grandfather had taught her years ago when she was a child learning the ways of survival. The fire provided some warmth and kept away the small predators that emerged after dark, scorpions and snakes that hunted in the relative cool. She rationed her water carefully, allowing herself only 3 small sips, and ate 2 dates that tasted like heaven after days of near starvation. As she sat by the fire, she sang quietly to her unborn child, old lullabies her mother had sung to her, promising that they would survive this ordeal and find a new life far from men like Rashid. The second day of walking was harder than the first. The adrenaline that had carried Mariam through her escape had faded, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and pain. Her feet were blistered and bleeding, her lips cracked despite careful water rationing, and her baby seemed to press on every internal organ simultaneously. She walked anyway, because stopping meant dying, and she had not fought this hard to give up now. Around noon, she saw something in the distance that made her heart leap with desperate hope. It was a tree, a single acacia standing impossibly alone in the wasteland, and where there were trees, there was usually water. She hurried toward it as fast as her damaged body would allow, and as she got closer, she saw that her guess was correct. A small spring bubbled from rocks at the tree's base, creating a pool of water no larger than a cooking pot but more precious than gold. Mariam collapsed beside the spring, drinking deeply, not caring that she was supposed to ration the water because her body was screaming for hydration and she could not resist the temptation of so much liquid after days of desperate thirst. The water was cool and slightly mineral in taste, the most delicious thing she had ever consumed. She splashed it on her face, her neck, her arms, washing away layers of sweat and dust and fear. For the first time since her wedding day, she felt something approaching peace. The tree provided shade from the afternoon sun, and the presence of water meant she could rest here for a day, maybe 2, gathering strength for the journey that still lay ahead. She had no illusions about being safe yet, she was still alone in the desert with limited supplies, but survival had shifted from impossible to merely difficult. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Mariam heard a sound that made her freeze in terror. Voices, carried on the evening breeze, speaking in a language she did not immediately recognize. Her first thought was that Rashid had somehow survived and tracked her to this place, but as the voices grew closer, she realized they belonged to women. A group of 4 figures appeared over a nearby dune, walking with the confident stride of people who knew the desert intimately. They were Bedouin women, members of one of the nomadic tribes that traveled the wasteland following ancient routes known only to them. They wore traditional dress, long robes and head coverings that protected them from sun and sand, and they carried themselves with a dignity that spoke of strength earned through hardship. The eldest of the women approached Mariam carefully, her weathered face showing concern rather than threat. She spoke in accented Arabic that Mariam could understand, asking what a pregnant woman was doing alone at the spring, where her family was, why her feet were bleeding and her dress torn. Mariam tried to answer, but emotion overwhelmed her and she began to cry, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. The story poured out of her in broken sentences, the forced marriage in the cage and the journey meant to end in death. She told them about the sandstorm that had saved her and the supplies she had found and the 2 days of walking that had brought her to this spring. The women listened without interruption, their faces growing darker with each detail, and when Mariam finally fell silent, the eldest woman spat on the ground in a gesture of contempt for Rashid and all men like him. The women took Mariam into their care with the efficiency of people accustomed to dealing with emergencies. They cleaned and bandaged her feet, gave her proper food, fresh flatbread and goat cheese and dried meat that made her stomach cramp with gratitude. They examined her belly with experienced hands, pronouncing that the baby was healthy and strong despite everything, a miracle that made them nod with satisfaction. The eldest woman, whose name was Hafsa, explained that they were traveling to their summer camp, a place where water was more plentiful and their tribe gathered during the hottest months. Mariam was welcome to join them, to stay as long as she needed, to give birth among women who would protect her and the child from anyone who might come looking. The offer was salvation beyond anything Mariam had dared hope for, and she accepted with gratitude that words could not adequately express. The journey to the summer camp took 3 more days, but traveling with the Bedouin women was nothing like the nightmare of Rashid's caravan. They walked during the cool hours of morning and evening, resting during the heat of midday in shelters they constructed from cloth and poles they carried with them. They sang as they walked, old songs about the desert and the stars and the spirits that watched over travelers. They told stories around the evening fire about women who had overcome impossible odds, about the strength that lived in female hearts when the world tried to break them. Mariam absorbed these lessons like a plant absorbing rain after drought, feeling something inside her that had been crushed slowly coming back to life. She was not broken. She was not a victim. She was a survivor, and her story was not over. The summer camp was more beautiful than Mariam had imagined. It was located in a valley where underground water came close enough to the surface that wells could be dug, where tough desert plants grew in abundance, where the tribe's goats and camels could graze on vegetation invisible to untrained eyes. Black tents stretched across the valley floor, home to 30 families who greeted Mariam with warmth and curiosity. Hafsa explained her situation to the tribal elders, who discussed the matter seriously before pronouncing that Mariam was under their protection now, that anyone who threatened her would answer to the entire tribe. It was not just charity, Hafsa explained later, but tradition. The desert was harsh and survival required people to help each other. Today Mariam needed help. Tomorrow she might be the one offering aid to another person in desperate need. Mariam gave birth 6 weeks later, assisted by the tribe's midwives who had delivered hundreds of babies in conditions ranging from comfortable to catastrophic. The labor was long and painful but without complications, and when her daughter emerged into the world, screaming with lungs that promised a strong will and fierce spirit, Mariam wept with joy and relief. She named the baby Samia, which meant companion in evening conversation, because she had been the companion that kept Mariam fighting through the darkest time of her life. The tribe celebrated the birth with feasting and music, welcoming Samia as one of their own, a daughter of the desert born under stars that had witnessed her mother's courage. Years passed, and Mariam built a new life among the Bedouin. She learned their ways, how to read the desert's moods, how to find water in places that seemed bone dry, how to navigate by stars and sun. She learned to weave cloth on portable looms, to make cheese from goat milk, to tan leather and fashion it into useful goods. She became valuable to the tribe not as a refugee but as a skilled member of their community. Samia grew into a bright, fearless child who ran through the camp with the other children, speaking the Bedouin dialect as fluently as Arabic, completely unaware that her life could have been so different. Sometimes traders would pass through the camp bringing news from the wider world, and once Mariam heard a story about a merchant named Rashid who had disappeared in the desert along with his entire caravan, never to be seen again. She felt nothing at this news, no satisfaction or regret, just a distant acknowledgement that sometimes the desert took what it was owed. On quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the valley and the stars spread across the sky like scattered diamonds, Mariam would sit outside her tent and remember the journey that had brought her here. She would think about the sandstorm that had come at the perfect moment, about the spring that had appeared exactly when she needed it, about the Bedouin women who had found her at the moment of her greatest need. Perhaps it had all been luck, a series of fortunate coincidences that had aligned to save her life. Or perhaps, as Hafsa insisted, the desert had recognized in Mariam something worth saving, a strength that deserved to be preserved and nurtured. Either way, Mariam had learned a truth that she would carry for the rest of her life and pass down to her daughter. The world could be cruel and unjust, men like Rashid could wield power without mercy, but there was also something else at work in the universe, a force that sometimes intervened on behalf of the powerless. The desert had chosen to save her, and she would spend the rest of her life honoring that gift by living with courage, by raising her daughter to be strong, and by offering help to others who found themselves chained by circumstances beyond their control. She had been a victim, then a prisoner, and finally a survivor. Now she was simply Mariam, daughter of the desert, mother of Samia, and living proof that sometimes freedom was worth any price and that the will to survive could move mountains or, in her case, entire sandstorms.